All right, great. So let's get started with the next session. We'll have two talks. The first one is on non-interactive universal arguments by Nir Betansky, Omer Paneth, Dana Shamir, and Tomer Salman. And Dana will give the talk.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dana Shamir, and I'm going to talk about non-interactive universal arguments. This is a joint work with Nir Betansky, Omer Paneth, and Tomer Salman. I will start with some introduction about succinct arguments, universal arguments, and non-interactive arguments, and then I will tell you about our results. So let me start with succinct arguments. In succinct arguments, we have some language in NP, and the prover needs to prove to the verifier some statement X. Since this is an NP language, the prover also needs to know the witness W. And we have the usual properties of completeness and computational soundness, where soundness holds against polynomial adversaries. And what makes it succinct is the double efficiency, which means that the prover runs in polynomial time. Okay, it is enough for the prover to decide the language. And the verifier is succinct. It only runs in linear time, so it needs the help of the prover in order to decide the language. Now, let me just say that I'm omitting here polynomial dependencies in the security parameter. So these are succinct arguments, and succinct arguments have become a central concept in cryptography. Many different notions are being studied, and one influential notion is the notion of universal arguments, which was introduced by Barak and Goldreich. So let me tell you about that. In a nutshell, using succinct arguments, we can give a protocol to prove any language in NP, but the protocol may depend on the language, and in particularly, it may depend on the runtime that it takes to decide the language. In contrast, using universal arguments, we can give one protocol to prove all languages in NP at once. And actually, using this protocol, we can even prove computations outside NP. So to talk more formally about universal arguments, a very standard way is to define the universal language. The universal language consists of all non-deterministic Turing machines, M, all inputs X, and number of steps T, such that M accepts X within T steps. Now, notice that the universal language covers all NP computations. However, the universal language itself isn't in NP, okay? Because it also contains super polynomial computations, because T here isn't bounded. This means that we can't use succinct arguments in order to prove the universal language. And that's the reason we need to define universal arguments. So what is a universal argument? Universal argument is simply a succinct argument for the universal language. So as you can see, this is the exact same image that we saw when talking about succinct arguments, only now the statement is an instance of the universal language, okay? It describes the computation mxt. And now, when I talk about double efficiency, I mean that the prover runs in polynomial time in T, which is enough for the prover to run the computation. And the verifier is succinct, it only runs in time logarithmic in T. And therefore, it needs the help of the prover in order to run the computation. And when we talk about computational soundness, we mean that soundness holds against adversaries that runs in polynomial time in the security parameter. Okay, I want to emphasize here something. If we want to prove a super polynomial computation, then the honest prover will run in super polynomial time. But soundness only holds against feasible polynomial adversaries, even if for some reason the adversary tries to prove a statement that is sub-exponential. Okay, so these are universal arguments, and now I want to try and explain why it is interesting, okay? So as I said before, using succinct arguments, we can give a protocol to prove any computation, but as long as we have some fixed polynomial upper bound on the number of steps t. In contrast, using universal arguments, we can give one protocol to prove all computations for any number of steps. And where is this useful? So first, there is Barak's protocol for zero knowledge using non-black box simulation. And this work is actually the work that led to defining the notion of universal arguments. Shortly, let me just say that in this protocol, the prover needs to prove some statement about the verifier's computation. And since we don't know in advance the size of the verifier, we need a universal argument. Another example is in something called incrementally verifiable computation, or IVC. In this setting, we don't build a proof at the end of the computation, but we build it step by step while the computation is taking place. And we might need to run the computation for an unknown number of steps. And so we don't want to have an a priori upper bound on the number of steps. Okay, so that's why universal arguments are important. And now let me tell you what we know about them. So for succinct arguments, there is Killian's result, where we can get the succinct arguments for any language in NP. And the assumption we need is collision-resistant hash. And now I want to ask, what about universality? Is this construction universal? So it turns out it has some weak property of universality. For any upper bound, T bar, even super polynomial, we can give a protocol to prove any computation that is bounded by T bar. But we have to paint the assumption, okay? Our assumption needs to be T bar secure. This property is what we call in our work a semi-universal argument. So this means that if we want to get a full-fledged universal argument out of this that works for any t, we will need a sub-exponential assumption. A sub-exponential assumption, this isn't satisfactory. We want to ask if this is inherent. Do we really need a sub-exponential assumption when the adversary we're facing is only polynomial? So, okay, it turns out that it isn't inherent. And what Barak and Goldreich showed is that you can construct a full-fledged universal argument for any number of steps t. T can be as big as 2 to the power of lambda, where lambda is the security parameter. And all we need to assume is a polynomially secure CRH. That's what we know about universal arguments. Now, I want to tell you one more thing. These protocols require 4 messages, okay? They are interactive. And in recent research, there is a lot of focus about non-interactive arguments. Many applications require non-interactive protocols. And in our work, we want to talk about universal arguments in the non-interactive setting. So our question is, do there exist non-interactive universal arguments? Now, let me tell you about the non-interactive setting. So I will tell you about succinct non-interactive arguments, also called SNARGS. And later I'll tell you about non-interactive universal arguments. So SNARGS are just like succinct arguments, only now the prover sends a single message to the verifier, and that's it. And also in the non-interactive setting, we need a common reference string, a CRS, that both the prover and the verifier know. And we have the same properties of completeness, computational soundness, and double efficiency. So these are SNARGS. And let me tell you what we know about them. There are tons of works about SNARGS for non-deterministic computation based on non-standard or heuristic assumptions. And there is also a recent line of works about SNARGS for deterministic computation based on standard assumptions. And they're also called SNARGS for P. And in this work, we continue in this direction. So what do we know about SNARGS for P? Today, I'm going to focus about polynomial assumptions. So under polynomial assumptions, we can construct SNARGS from P from either LWE or D-lim. Okay, now I want to ask again, what about universality? Is this construction universal? It turns out that we are in the same situation as in the interactive setting. They are semi-universal, which means that for any upper bound T-bar, we can give a protocol to prove any computation that is bounded by T-bar, but we pay in the assumption. The assumption has to be T-bar secure. And again, this means that if we want to get full-fledged universal arguments out of this, we will need a sub-exponential assumption. And I want to ask, is this inherent? Do we really need a sub-exponential assumption when the adversary we're facing is only polynomial? So the goal in our work is to construct a universal SNARG for deterministic computation for any number of steps with only polynomial assumptions. Okay, so this is our goal. And now let me tell you about our results. Our main result is that we construct a non-interactive universal argument. And the assumptions we need are first, either LWE or D-lim. Okay, these are the same polynomial assumptions that we needed to construct SNARGS for P. And we also need to assume fully homomorphic encryption, which follows from LWE and circular security. And we also need a very mild worst-case complexity assumption. So this is our main result, and let me tell you a little bit more about our results and about this complexity assumption. So to get different notions of universal arguments, we will need a different complexity assumption. If we only want soundness to hold against uniform adversaries, then we don't need any complexity assumption. It is enough to assume LW or D-lim and FHE. But if we want soundness to hold against any adversary, then we need a complexity assumption. And what we assume is that circuits of fixed polynomial size cannot decide all of P. And we also construct a universal incrementally verifiable computation. And in this case, we need a similar assumption, which means that a non-uniform advice cannot speed up all polynomial computations, but we restrict the computations to be computations of a bounded space. So these are our assumptions. And again, we really think that these assumptions are mild. For example, they both follow from non-uniform exponential type hypothesis. Okay, so these are our results. And in the rest of the talk, I will talk about our techniques. So behind the proof of all of these theorems, there is one general lifting theorem. What we show is how you take some SNARG for P and lift it into a universal argument. And the way we do it, we use the help of a cryptographic tool, some notion of cryptographic puzzles. Okay, this is a very high level, our lifting theorem. Now, let me tell you more precisely what we are doing. So actually, we show something a little weaker. We show that you can take what we called a semi-universal argument, where soundness holds only if T is bounded by a polynomial, and lift it into a universal argument where soundness holds for any T. And now, why is this a good place to start from, this semi-universal argument? Because, as I mentioned before, all existing constructions of SNARGS for P actually give us a semi-universal argument under polynomial assumptions. So basically, what we need to show is how to take an argument where soundness only holds if T is polynomial and lift it into an argument where soundness holds for any T. Okay, before I tell you how we prove this lifting theorem, I want to give some intuition about why existing constructions aren't universal. So we have these constructions for SNARGS for P, And as I said before, they aren't universal. So what is the problem? What are the challenges we are facing when trying to prove that these constructions are universal? So suppose we have some construction and we want to prove it has universal soundness. We assume by contradiction that there is some polynomial adversary that convinces the verifier of a false statement. And now we define a reduction algorithm that runs the adversary in a certain way in order to break the assumption. So now if we look deeply into the reduction, it turns out that the reduction needs to run the entire computation of the statements. Okay, it needs to know if the statement is true or false. This means that the reduction's running time depends on the number of steps t. But the number of steps t isn't bounded. It could be super polynomial. And then the reduction will run in super polynomial time. And we don't get a contradiction because our assumption is only polynomial. So this is the problem in existing constructions. And now let me tell you the main idea of how we prove of how we solve this problem. So again, we have this reduction. And the problem is that the running time of the reduction depends on t. And t could be very big. What we want to do is to find some way to make sure that t isn't too big. So what we do is we use the fact that the adversary runs in polynomial time in order to make sure that it doesn't try to prove any statement that is too big. We're going to make sure that the adversary only claims statements that it is able to compute on its own. So what we do is we ask the prover to prove that it actually executed a time t computation. And now this means that t is smaller than the running time of the adversary. And the running time of the adversary is polynomial. So t is polynomial. And the reduction runs in polynomial time. And now we get a contradiction to the polynomial assumption. Now, actually, this is where the puzzles come in. How do you prove that you executed a time t computation? You simply solve a puzzle that is t hard. Okay, so that's the main idea. And now, before I tell you about our construction, first, I want to tell you about the cryptographic puzzles that we use. So when we talk about cryptographic puzzles, we think of some difficulty parameter t and the solver and the challenger. The challenger samples a puzzle instance z, and the solver solves it and sends the solution. And now the challenger can verify if the solution is indeed the right solution. Now, the puzzles that we use in our construction have the following properties. First, we need completeness, which means that the solver that runs in time approximately t will be able to solve the puzzle. We also want fast sampling and verification, which means that the challenger runs in time logarithmic in t. Okay, the challenger doesn't need to be able to solve the puzzle on its own. And we also want the puzzle to be hard, so we require soundness, which means that the solver that runs in time significantly less than t won't be able to solve the puzzle. Now, actually, the puzzles that we use only have semi-universal soundness. So semi-universal soundness is very similar to the soundness that we have in the semi-universal argument. Okay, so soundness only holds if t is bounded by a polynomial. Okay, so these are the puzzles that we use, and we can actually construct this puzzle from the worst case complexity assumption. And this is also the place where we use FHE. And we actually use here the semi-universal argument again. So we use the semi-universal argument in two places. First, when boosting it into a universal argument, and second, when constructing the cryptographic puzzles. So these are the cryptographic puzzles that we use. And now let me tell you in one slide what is our construction and how we use these puzzles. So we start with what we have. What we have is a semi-universal argument where soundness only holds if t is bounded by a polynomial. Now, we want to make sure that the adversary doesn't try to prove a statement that it can't compute. We want the adversary to solve, the prover to solve a puzzle of difficulty t. And we don't know in advance what T is going to be. So what we do is we add to the CRS lambda puzzle instances of increasing difficulty. The ith puzzle will have difficulty 2 to the power of I. And now the prover will solve the puzzle with difficulty the closest to T. Okay? And a prover that runs in time T can solve this puzzle. And an adversary that tries to claim a statement that it can't compute won't be able to solve the puzzle. Now, actually, our construction is a little more complicated. And it is related to the fact that the puzzles are only semi-universal. I'm not going to say any more about it, but we need a prover to solve all puzzles up to difficulty T. And this is our construction. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about how we prove that it is sound. So we want to prove that it is sound, so we assume by contradiction there is some polynomial adversary that convinces the verifier of a false statement. And we want to split into 2 cases according to the size of the statement. If the statement is very big, okay, the adversary cannot compute the statement, then the adversary shouldn't be able to solve the puzzle, and we can use the soundness of the puzzle. On the other hand, if the statement is small, okay, and the adversary is able to compute the statement, then we have an upper bound on T, okay? The adversary runs in polynomial time, so we know that T is bounded by a polynomial. And now we can use the soundness of the semi-universal argument. Okay, so that's the idea of how we prove soundness, and this is what I want to tell you about our construction. Now let me conclude with some future directions. So first, it will be interesting to see if we can actually use a direct analysis on existing constructions to show that they are universal without relying on puzzles. And actually, this is what Barak and Goldreich did when they constructed an interactive universal argument. Another direction is that actually in this work, we use some method of using puzzles in order to reduce super polynomial assumptions into polynomial assumptions. And it will be interesting to see if we can use a similar method in other settings. So for example, there is actually a previous work by Bitansky and Solomon where they use a similar method to bootstrap level homomorphic encryption into fully homomorphic encryption. That's it. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Please come to the microphone or ask in the chat online. Can you say a little bit about the Barak-Goldreich technique and why it doesn't work for the non-interactive case? Or
so what Barak and Goldreich do is they take Killian's protocol and they do a different analysis in a way that the reduction doesn't need to run in time T. It only like sample a few places and checks, and then it doesn't depend on T. And actually, we started doing it on the KRR construction, but then this idea came up, so we might be able to do it too.
I'm curious, for these cryptographic puzzles, do you have a different set of cryptographic puzzles for every different SNARG, or do you have to generate a new one each time, new set of puzzles each time? Because wouldn't the latter would not be non-interactive, and the former, if you only have a certain set of puzzles, you could pre-compute all the answers. I'm just curious where the puzzles, which party generates the puzzles?
Oh, okay. So you generate the puzzles in the setup. When you generate the CRS, that's where you sample the puzzle instance. Mm-hmm. And the reason we needed a semi-universal argument is to verify the puzzle. So the prover will create a proof that the solution it sent is actually the right solution using the semi-universal argument. Mm-hmm. And the verifier will use it to verify.
That makes sense. Thank you.
It said that if you are considering the uniform adversary, then you don't need to make the computational assumption. The complexity assumptions.
Right.
But in that setting, do you still need the non-uniform security of, for example, FHE? Or basically, I'm asking, is your reduction uniform? Or non-uniform?
Actually, I think that in this case, we will also need, the FHE doesn't need non-uniform security.
I see. So the reduction will be uniform.
Yeah.
Also, for the second direction you mentioned, is it true that if I want to use this technique to treat the superpolynomial Harris subsumption to polynomial one, do you think it's inherent that I have to make some complexity assumptions like you made in? For example, in the Vitansky work, do they also make computation complexity assumptions?
So it is inherent to use puzzles, and there are different notions of puzzles. In this work, we use like the minimal puzzles that we can think of that will be enough for our construction. But you can use like any construction of puzzle that is enough for what you need. So it depends on the puzzles that you use, what they need.
So that means the complexity assumption you make is mainly for the design of puzzles.
Exactly. Yes.
All right, great. Let's thank Donna. Great, and our next talk is on non-interactive zero knowledge from non-interactive batch arguments by Jeffrey Champion and David Wu, and Jeffrey will give the talk.
So in this talk, we're going to be focusing on non-interactive proof systems for a language L and NP. This is a two-party protocol between a prover and a verifier, where the prover with its statement X and witness W wants to convince the verifier that basically with the proof pi, that the instance X is in the language L. And then the verifier can choose to accept or reject. Now, two core properties of such a proof system are completeness and soundness. Completeness says that honest proofs of true statements verify, and soundness says that false statements basically should never verify. And when we limit the prover to be efficient in soundness, we call this an argument system. But in this talk, I will be using proof and argument interchangeably. So in addition to these basic properties, sort of two simple questions you could ask are, how short can we make the proof? And can we make it so that the proof actually hides something about the witness W? And these actually lead into, these sort of motivate two fundamental properties of cryptographic proof systems, which are succinctness and zero knowledge. And these have received extensive study over the past 20 years or so, partly due to the emergence of blockchains as well as verifiable computation. So we have these two fundamental properties. A natural question to ask is, can we connect these two properties? In particular, it's very intuitive to see that if we have a proof which is shorter than the witness, this should be inherently hiding something about the witness as well. And so that leads us into the central question for this talk, which is, can we show that succinctness implies zero knowledge? So as an early step in this direction, stopped working. Okay, as an early step in this direction, Kitagawa, Matsuda, and Yamakawa showed that one-way functions plus SNARGS for NP imply non-interactive zero knowledge, or a NIZC, for NP. And here by SNARGS, we mean succinct non-interactive arguments where the proof length is less than the witness length. And so this definition of succinctness is actually very powerful. because in fact, there is strong evidence that SNARGs for NP with adaptive soundness actually require non-falsifiable assumptions. While on the other hand, NISICs for NP can be constructed from a variety of standard assumptions. So a natural follow-up question to ask here is, can we relax succinctness and get some sort of analogous result? And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So the relaxation we're going to consider is a batch argument for NP, also called a BARG. And in this setting, the prover wants to prove that M NP statements are all in the language L. And the relaxation on succinctness is that it's going to be amortized over the number of statements M. And in particular, this means that the proof size actually grows linearly with the length of the witness. So this is quite different from a SNARG. So this is certainly a relaxation on the succinctness property, but why should we actually care about this specific relaxation? Well, one reason is because there's been numerous previous works on BARGs for NP, and part of the motivation for that is that sort of batch arguments or batch languages are a subset of NP where we can get around this Gentry-Wichs separation. And additionally, batch arguments themselves are sort of useful for, like if we have a succinct proof of them, this is useful for things like aggregate signatures. And furthermore, it can actually be shown that BARGs for NP imply SNARGs for P. So the batch requirement is not too restrictive if we are willing to go from NP down to P. Okay, so now that I've sort of set up why BARGs are like a good relaxation, let's get into what we can actually show. So in this work, we show that a local pseudorandom generator, or PRG, plus a BARG for NP, plus lossy public key encryption, which is used as a dual mode commitment, implies a NISIC for NP. And by local PRG, we mean a PRG where each input bit depends only on a small number of, or each output bit depends only on a small number of input bits. And by dual mode commitment, we mean a commitment which has two modes, a statistically hiding mode and a statistically binding mode. So now that we have also one additional note is that if showing this result also sort of shows that the BARG itself has a zero knowledge property, because if certain properties hold, we get a composition between a BARG and a NISIC into a BARG with zero knowledge. So now that we have our goal in mind, let's get into the approach. So we're going to be using something called the hidden bits paradigm, which is also used by Kitagawa et al., but was originally introduced as the hidden bits model by Baige, Lapidot, and Shamir. And so this is an idealized model where the prover is going to have access to a uniform string, which we will call R, that is going to be hidden from the verifier. And now, when the prover sends its proof, it's also going to send an index set capital I, which is going to sort of reveal the chosen indices to the verifier. But the verifier, again, cannot see any of the non-revealed indices. And it turns out that in this model, we can get NISICs unconditionally. And sort of the reason for that is because we get zero knowledge from the fact that the verifier does not see the unrevealed bits. And we sort of get soundness from the fact that the prover has no control over this string R. So it has to somewhat play honestly. But again, this is an idealized model, so we need some way of converting it into a real NISIC in the CRS model, which CRS stands for Common Reference String. And so intuitively, the way we're going to do that is by replacing this special string R with a common reference string, which can be seen by both the prover and the verifier. And then we are going to make the prover sample the hidden bits R by itself from some sparse subset of 0, 1 to the M with some short randomness rho. And once it does this, it's going to prove that these bits were sampled correctly for some definition of correctly. And then the verifier is just going to check both of the proofs. So this is sort of intuitively how we can compile this idealized NISIC into sort of a real NISIC. So let's formalize this a little bit more with the notion of a hidden bits generator. So hidden bits generator is going to have very similar syntax. It's going to have a CRS generation algorithm, an algorithm for generating the bits, an algorithm for proving that the bits are generated correctly, and an algorithm for verifying everything. And so the actual properties we want are binding, which says that the hidden bits strings form a sparse subset of 0, 1 to the m, such that no efficient prover can output a valid proof that disagrees with this subset. Then we're also going to have a hiding property, which says that no efficient verifier can distinguish the unseen hidden bits from uniform, given its view of the honest prover. And just as a note, that this abstraction is indeed enough to get an ISIC. So all that remains is to construct a hidden bits generator, or HBG. So to get some intuition for this, we're going to take a quick look at the construction from Kitagawa et al. So their hidden bit string is just going to be the output of a PRG, and the proof of correctness is just going to be a SNARG proof that that basically certifies that for each I in capital I, the corresponding output bits of the PRG were indeed computed by the PRG on S. To quickly see, binding, we get the sparsity property by PRG expansion, and we get the validity check by the SNARG soundness. And then to see hiding, basically the way we show that RI complement is close to uniform is by treating the proof as leakage, which is going to be shorter than the seed, and then sort of arguing leakage resilience to say that the PRG is still uniform, even with this leakage. And one more thing to note is that this language that is proved by the by the SNARG is already somewhat of a batch language. And so one might wonder, like, can we just directly switch SNARG for Barak and get the result right there? Well, there are two problems with this. One is that the Barak proof grows linearly with the size of the witness, which in this case is the seed. So there's basically going to be no hope of leakage resilience because the Barak proof is too long. The second issue is that in the Barak setting, each statement comes with a corresponding witness, and these witnesses have no guarantee of how they relate to each other. They don't have to all be the same. So there's basically a problem with consistency and a problem with the proof length. To deal with the proof length, we're going to use a local PRG to shorten the witness, because now the witness will only become a few bits of the seed, which the particular output bit depends on. And to deal with the consistency issue, we're going to commit to the PRG seed S and basically prove a slightly different language that also checks consistency. So this is some intuition. Let's get into the actual details of the construction. So the prover is going to sample a PRG seed and run the PRG on it to get some longer string T. And then it's going to take this long string T and break it up into blocks of length B. So we're going to have M blocks, B1 through BM. And then we're going to apply a randomness extractor to each of these blocks to get basically a hidden bit string R1 through RM, where each extractor on a block corresponds to a bit of the string. Now, to prove that this was generated correctly, what we're going to do is take the bits of the seed and commit to them bit by bit to get commitments C1 through CM. And then we're also going to generate a Barak proof where each statement is going to be related to an output bit of the PRG, TI. And recall that because we have a local PRG, this only depends on a small number of the bits of the seed. And so we're going to only consider the commitments corresponding to those bits of the seed. And then we're basically going to show that like an opening of these particular commitments is a subseed that indeed computes TI. So what the actual proof is going to look like is it's going to be a Barak proof where for each I in capital I, we prove all of the statements in that block. Meaning if, for example, 1 is in capital I, we prove statements 1 through B, and so And then we're also going to send over the revealed blocks along with all of the commitments. And then to facilitate using the commitment and the BARG, our CRS is just going to be the CRS, corresponding CRSs for both of those primitives. And then all of the verifier has to do is check the extraction for itself and also check that the BARG proof verifies. So this is the construction. So let's get into a quick sketch of the proof. So binding, recall, says that the hidden bit strings form some sparse subset of 0, 1 to the m, such that no efficient prover can output a valid proof that disagrees with this subset. We again get sparsity by PRG expansion, but this time the validity check is going to come from BARG soundness plus the statistical binding of the commitment, which is currently in binding mode. So that's binding. Hiding says that no efficient verifier can distinguish the unseen hidden bits from uniform given its view of the honest prover. So the way we're going to try and show this is basically show that the unrevealed blocks, BI complement, all have some sufficiently high entropy, because if this holds, then the extractor will give us the desired result. So the way we're going to show this is by basically trying to get rid of all of the leakage on the PRG seed and do a leakage resilient argument similar to the previous technique. So the first thing we're going to do is switch the commitment to hiding mode and switch all of the commitments to the seed to commitments of 0. And at this point, the only leakage left on the PRG seed is going to be pi BARG itself, which is going to be using the subseeds as witnesses. And so we can sort of, at this point, argue leakage resilience in the following sense, that by complexity leveraging and locality, we can say that T is close to uniform so long as the BARG proof becomes some correlated distribution with T. But this is actually enough already because the BARG proof is short, and thus this output of this distribution will be short. And by setting parameters correctly, we can make this less than the block length, thus giving us the entropy guarantee that we desired and completing the proof. So just to recap, we show that a local PRG plus lossy PKE plus a BARG for NP implies a NIZC for NP, where here the locality we can tolerate up to order log n, where n is the seed length, which is a little bit weaker than the usual notion of constant locality. And yeah, so before we get to open questions, there has been a subsequent work in this direction very recently by Batansky, Kamath, Paneth, Rothblum, and Vasudevan, which basically shows that a BARG for NP plus a dual mode commitment implies a NIZC for NP with also a statistical zero knowledge mode. Okay. And basically their techniques are quite different from ours because they don't use the hidden bits model at all. They basically, in this work, they basically focus on showing how batch arguments imply statistical witness indistinguishability. So now onto the remaining open questions. Number one is, can we weaken the lossy PKE assumption to plain PKE or one-way functions? And then additionally, it'd be interesting if we could get some sort of maybe stronger primitive like a ZAP or a NIWI from similar assumptions, maybe including lossy PKE. And then more broadly, what else can we construct from batch arguments since they're a relatively young primitive? And even more broadly, what other succinctness implies privacy statements can we show? Say, like, can we show that succinctness implies some strong form of encryption? That's all for this talk. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. We have time for questions. Quick question for the local PRG. You don't really need constant locality. You just need it to be like relatively local to the output size. Is that correct? And is that maybe like a weaker? Do you know how that compares to like the Goldreich BRG assumption?
Right. So we don't need constant locality, but I think basically the main difference is that, well, actually, we don't necessarily need a local PRG. I think it's possible if you have basically a PRG that can be verified in a short time compared to the seed length, like n to the delta or something if the seed length is n. But that's basically the reason for the order log locality. But I think basically the main difference is that log locality does not have any known sub-exponential attacks, whereas constant does.
But you could even have higher than log local or log. You cannot handle like security parameter locality.
If it gets to log locality, then basically the full truth table becomes too large. So that's basically the reason why it's basically some constant less than 1 times log.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Jeffrey again. And so that concludes the session.